Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Naval Academy's Ethics Across the Curriculum workshop. I'm Jeff McCrease. I'm the Deputy Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership. So this is day 2, Tuesday of our 5-day workshop. And before we get started on day 2, I'd like to remind everyone that this is a joint endeavor from the Vice Admiral James B Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership, the Naval Academy Center for Teaching and Learning, the USNA Division of Leadership Education and Development, and the USNA Engineering and Weapons Division. And this workshop is made possible through a generous grant from the Ingersoll family. A review of what we did yesterday: we started off with introductions and we shared our participants' goals for what they hope to get out of this workshop. We spent the bulk of the day reviewing the Naval Academy's Leadership Course Sequence Overview, and we spent some time talking about accreditation and ethics requirements of ABET, ACS, and Middle States Commission on Higher Education. Today, then, the bulk of today is going to be a discussion of ethics, a broad overview of more reasoning based on how we teach it at the Naval Academy. And day 2 then is going to come before our 3 final days. On Wednesday, we'll spend some time talking about constructing effective learning outcomes. We'll also talk about how to use and incorporate technology into the classroom, and we'll work on our ethics projects that our individual participants are working on about how to bring ethics into their own disciplines and their own classrooms. Thursday will be a day of asynchronous work, and then Friday we'll wrap up with presentations, and our invited guests will be asked to come join us as well. So today, we started off with a previously unrecorded session sharing our last night's homework, reflections on connections between the Naval Academy's leadership courses and your own academic disciplines curriculum. And we'll yield here in a moment to a broad overview of moral reasoning then, based on how it's taught in U.S. Naval Academy's NE 203 course, Ethics and Moral Reasoning for the Naval Officer. And then we've got some homework here for people to conduct tonight after the conclusion of the seminar. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Doug Rao from the Naval Academy's Lead Division for the introduction of our 2 facilitators today. Professor Rao?
Very good. Thank you very much, Jeff. And to all of you, thank you very much for the participation, and certainly have greatly appreciated your feedback on what you learned yesterday about the continuum that we have in LEL, Leadership, Ethics, and Law, and the way our courses run through the plebe learning about leadership, the ethics course, NE 203, which is the ethics and moral reasoning for a junior officer, into leadership as a process, and then also in law for our course. And just having your feedback on how we can be better to integrate this within LEL and across the art is really important. So today, the focus is really to learn more about this course, NE 203, Ethics and Moral Reasoning for the Naval Officer. And, you know, we teach it in a 16-week semester. It's taught to all of our youngsters. There's an intent on why it's taught youngster year. It's very important. During this summertime, we're teaching it in 8 weeks. In Block 3, we'll teach it in 4 weeks. And at OCS, the Officer Candidate School, we teach this course in 1 day, and you're going to get it in 3 hours, or maybe even a little bit less. And so I applaud Marcus and Roger for taking this on, and for you to be ready to take this on with a fire hose. So the presentation will be given in a pairing with Dr. Marcus Hidal. And Marcus, as you know, is a prior Air Force officer who has a degree in philosophy. He is a roller derby enthusiast, and he is our resident Stoic. And those things have just added greatly into his presentation that he gives. So he gives the presentation on Monday as the philosopher, and on the following 2 classes in the week, there are senior officers who take on that mantle and take on the presentation. But the other presenter, of course, is our course director, and that's Captain Roger Herbert. And Roger is a retired naval officer. He is a SEAL. He went to Davidson College, got his terminal degree at University of Virginia, and has great war stories to tell, but also has a great passion for this issue of ethics and moral reasoning at wartime and in peace. So with that, I'd like to just turn it over to these 2 folks. And Captain Herbert, Dr. Herbert, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, hey, thanks a lot, Doug. So just a couple of things, preliminaries. First of all, I wanted to shout out an appreciation for Admiral Baker's beard. I haven't seen that yet until today. Awesome, yep. Second thing, I'm afraid I don't think I have any war stories today. Sorry about that. And then one other sort of clarification, I guess, to the introduction, and that is I can't, Marcus and I can't possibly teach any 203 in 3 hours. Or even, we can tell you, I gave you a quick outline of what we do and how we teach. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on, I guess, the major area of any 203, and that is giving our students a framework and understanding for moral reasoning, a how-to. And that's what Marcus and I decided to focus on today. And there's tons more in any 203 of great fascination, but we're going to focus on this aspect of it. And we'll deliver it in 3 parts. I'm going to talk for the next 45 minutes or so, mostly about moral perception. Then Marcus is going to talk about the process of moral deliberation, what you all, it was part of your all's read-aheads. And then I'm going to just close up with a brief thought about moral decision making, which is actually a separate entity. It's you do all deliberation you want, but at the end of the day, you have to make a decision, and that is a different thing. So cool. That's our enterprise for today. This quote was in a SOF, appeared in a SOF a number of years ago. I came to NE 203 with a compass. You gave me a map. I think this student was prescient, because this is before we started really focusing on what we've come to call a moral deliberation roadmap. But that really is always, or at least it was a large part of what we've been trying to do in NE 203, is to provide that roadmap. And the question then comes, when is the right time to pull out that map? So let's think a little bit about the metaphor before we go into our take on this. Calling on a random person on my screen here. Mark, have you driven to the grocery store in the last, say, 2 weeks? Was that a yes?
Yes,
okay.
I have.
Okay, good. So keep your mic open for a second, because I'm going to ask a follow-on question. I assume that when you went to the grocery store, you consulted your map and you were thumbing along the whole way as you were making right and left-hand turns, yeah?
No, I did not consult the map.
Oh, wait. Now, why was that? Is it because food is unimportant to you?
That's just funny. No.
And my students don't think so. They're usually throwing things at me at this point. But
yeah, I mean, Mark's a good choice for that question, though.
No, so why don't you use this? Seriously, why don't you consult your map when you're going to get food? Because obviously food is a very important thing. We need it every day.
Because I know where the grocery store is. It's 2 right turns away.
Nice. So in other words, we've developed habits for these. And I think this is a good way. So now taking it away from the metaphor, we make, thanks, Mark, by the way, appreciate that. I'll cold call somebody else next. We make routine decisions, routine moral decisions every single day, hundreds of them probably, mostly like we're going to the grocery store without even thinking about it. We just make these decisions. This morning, I walked right past my wife Gretchen's purse, and I didn't rifle through it and steal $20 bills. And I didn't have to stop and consult Immanuel Kant before I did that. I just walked right past it. When we walked past our friends, I took my dog out for a walk, and I walked past a neighbor this morning, and he said hello. And I didn't tell him to go to hell. I smiled and said hello back. These are moral decisions we make without really even thinking about it. And they're very important. And we can never lose track of how important those are. But every once in a while, we are confronted with decisions that warrant deliberate moral reflection. We have to stop and think about them. And typically, I think, especially people who have lots of experience like us making moral decisions, before we think about it, there's probably a feeling as we're confronted with these decisions, sort of a rumbling in our stomach, or the hair on the back of our necks stands up and alerts us that something's happening. There was a speaker here a little while ago, actually quite some time ago, probably maybe a decade ago or so, named Rushworth Kidder. Have y'all heard of Kidder before? I think he's a philosopher. I'm not positive, but he does. That's the realm he works in, is moral theory. And when he was here, he brought up this idea of a moral thermocline. And I personally, we don't teach this in any 203, but I love this idea of a moral thermocline. And by the way, he taught it. He used it in a speech here, or in a presentation here. From what I can gather, he never wrote it down, and he's dead now. So I'm going to take full credit for this somewhere and publish it, because I think it's a great idea. Can somebody explain what a thermocline is?
It's a change of temperatures within a body of water.
Good. That's beautiful. That's exactly what I think that's why Rushworth brought that here, because we all think about water here. By the way, none of my students know what a thermocline is, which is nuts. So water is interesting. The way it goes, though, is it's so I'm a diver, right? I sort of predict how cold the water is or whatever, and I put on my wetsuit, and I dive down, and I dive down, and I dive down, and feels pretty good, and I congratulate myself on picking the right wetsuit. But the thing is that water doesn't just get colder, colder, colder as you go down. For some weird reason, and some of you all could probably tell me, it layers. So there's like a line in the water, and you pass through that line, and you're like, oh, I wish I had a thicker wetsuit. I'm not going to pick on somebody for this. Okay, so somebody think for a second. All right, everybody think for a second. What color is the water above the thermocline? Above the thermocline, what color is the water? And I'm having some, okay, so chat it in. What color is the water above the thermocline? Depends on the depth, is there? Change the color below. All right. Yeah, cool. All right. So good. You guys are scholars. So yes, I did this yesterday with my students, and it's always interesting. I get yesterday my first answer, and it had to do with the refraction of light through water. Said that the color of the water above the thermocline is red. And then I typically get a lot of blues and a lot of greens. Every once in a while, I will bring a little bit of a help for my students. So water above the thermocline is clear, and water below the thermocline is clear. So in other words, and I've spent way too much time on this, but I have fun with it with my students. In other words, we don't see this thermocline, we just feel it. And that feeling is really important, I think, in our ability to deliberate and to perceive the moral world. But there are also ways of knowing that we have crossed the moral thermocline, knowing that we've entered into this realm where that warrants deliberate moral analysis. And I think the map analogy here is good. So I'm a Knowles instructor. I don't know if any of y'all had a chance to do a Knowles course. If you haven't, you ought to do it. But here right now I'm in Western North Carolina. I've lived here for the last several years before I came to Annapolis. And I can do 30-mile treks out here without consulting the map. I just know it. I know it as well as Mark knows his way to the grocery store. But when I go on a Knowles course, I'm consulting the map every single day, all the time. And I do thumb along as I'm walking. And the reasons are, first, it's unfamiliar. I don't know Wyoming like I know Western North Carolina. Second of all, there's typically a number of ways of getting to the same place that are, that maybe they're both good, maybe they're both really bad, but there are a number of ways of doing it. And I try to pick the best of the various routes to get to a location. And the third is, as a Knowles instructor, I have an ethical, moral obligation to bring all of my students back in the upright position in a pulse. And if I get them lost, that's probably not good. So I think it works the same in the moral world. Some alerts that we've crossed the moral thermocline, it's time for some deliberate moral analysis. Is first, that idea is like, I've never seen this before. This is not something that I'm used to, that I've developed habits for. The second thing is, we could often be facing conflicting moral obligations. A couple of right answers, a couple of wrong answers, and maybe one is more right than the other, just like those routes can be different. So there, it's time to break out our moral deliberation roadmap. And the third, I think that this intuition doesn't ever quite go away. I'm almost 60 years old, and sometimes I think about it. And that is that, I could get in trouble for this. I have got a moral obligation to get this right. And therefore, I better stop and think through it. Okay. There we go. So there are external influences that shape and sometimes distort our ability to perceive the important features of the moral world. And they can alert us to our moral duties, but they can also obfuscate. And there's a bunch of them. We talk about several of these with our students, and I'll share those with you. So the first is just our culture. So we are introduced to cultural narratives shortly after emerging from the womb. and we swim in these cultural narratives our whole lives. They tell us who we are as a community, however you define community, and how within that community we should live our lives. They help us put different situations and events into context and tell us, how our heroes have dealt with those situations, how our villains have dealt with those situations. The narrative of American exceptionalism, has propelled our country to, some real righteous moral outrage that we did things about, for the good, but they've also likely prompted some atrocities as well. As a SEAL, I swim in the narrative of I will not quit, I will not fail. And again, I think as I look at my career, these have served me well. They've allowed me to understand what is important and what's not important in the moral world. I also swim in the narrative that started somewhere around the Vietnam era of, you are a stone cold killer, and that can get you into trouble. And we've seen some of that in the news. So I'm wondering, what are some of the cultural narratives that maybe our students swim in that can highlight the moral world for them, or maybe obfuscate what's important? Any thoughts? Yeah, Karen.
I see my students struggle a lot with the pressures to be successful that make them feel like they need to, do anything possible in order to have the best chance at the service selection that they want. And that leads them to cut corners and sometimes even to be tempted to be academically dishonest.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we put these guys on a pedestal. We meaning the America. They go out on Main Street and they're heroes, and yet they all know deep inside that they're not that they're just normal people. Yeah, that's awesome.
I could say something about teaching about the Middle East. It used to be, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago that if you asked why did you come to the Naval Academy, people would cite 9/11 and the Twin Towers and, just trying to keep America safe and freedom's not free and those narratives. And you still sometimes get that residual, but the sense that we are threatened by, in many cases, a sort of a Muslim terrorist network leads people to make certain decisions to come to the academy. And then they come into my class and we're trying to sort of just understand the region of the Middle East or of the Islamic world on its own. And sometimes that creates tensions where maybe some of the frameworks which shape their decision-making about their commitment to serve are challenged by some of our policy decisions in the region. And so it just brings ethics like right into your face. And I also face challenges because at the end of the day, my goal is that I don't want them to know where I stand on any issue. And to be honest, my stance on issues changes day to day by, ongoing political transformations. But I think that there's a kind of certainly culture plays a role in how we think about the enemy. And that has different sides to it too, right? People in the Middle East might think of us as an enemy, and that forces us to kind of get close to, alternative ways of looking at things, and that can be really disorienting. So that's just throwing something there.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. And kind of, I think, depending on where my dissertation was on propaganda, and sort of depending on where you get your news, you're sort of swimming in two different seas regarding that issue, regarding what is Islam and who are these people. Yeah, awesome. Others? Admiral Baker, I think you're talking, but I'm not hearing. Is anybody else hearing Admiral Baker? No. You got the little green dots, but oh my. Sign language? No. Okay. Mark, did you want to come in on this? I saw your green dots.
I was gonna say, this conversation I had yesterday with my students really took me by surprise. That it picks up on what Karen was just saying, but maybe it's even worse. That the narrative that several of the students were clinging to was not only should you do everything you can to improve yourself, but you should also be grateful for those opportunities, and grateful for the opportunity to take advantage of those opportunities. And the flip side of that was some very stringent judgment of people who weren't grateful, who were taking advantage of opportunities but not gratefully, even in the face of the effects of domestic abuse, even in the face of the effects of major depression, just real judgment that why aren't they grateful? And I think that it struck me then, and even more when I was listening to Karen talk, that's an astonishing burden for them. That not only do they have to have this continuous self-improvement, but they have to maintain the right attitude all the time. There's not a lot of room for error in that worldview.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And so this is a really interesting topic, and I wish we could just talk about this. I've got 5 others, but it is interesting, and maybe another. And we all, the point is, we all swim in our various narratives, and another probably interesting question to ask is, what are the narratives that we ourselves are swimming in? It's nice to be able to at least identify. They're not bad. Again, they're going to help us, and we can't help it. We need to swim somewhere. But it's probably a good thing to ask. And this one is really related to what both Karen and Mark were saying. Is ambition is a driver, and if we are honest with ourselves, one of the dominant elements in our lives is that desire to sit at the cool girl table. Yeah, and then once we're finally invited to the cool girl table, then we realize that the coolest girls sit at the next table over, and then we start dreaming of that day that we are going to be welcomed to that table. And I say, when we're honest with ourselves, maybe I'm telling too much about myself. I fall into this category, and our students read this brilliant essay by C.S. Lewis that has kind of opened my eyes to myself in some ways, and it's called The Inner Ring. And I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's really worth the read. Actually, it was a speech he gave somewhere. But Lewis writes, here's one of the things he writes is, of all the passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a man whom is not yet a very bad man, do very bad things. So, I mean, I guess all I've described of the inner ring is the cool girl table, but given that description and what Lewis is saying about it, I mean, what's he getting at? What is he trying to say by highlighting that this is a danger, this drive to move to that inner ring, whatever that inner ring is, that inner ring that we're outside of right now, and we so much desire to get in.
You never get there.
Go on, Mark.
There's always another ring. There's always more money. There's always more power. There's always a different country. There's always a bigger house. You never get there. Awesome.
Yeah, and that's exactly. And have you read his essay?
No, but I think of it more in terms of Veblen conspicuous consumption. That this sort of spiral of, which is a slightly different take on ambition, but it's the same sort of end result, right? That this sense that everything will be okay once it doesn't work. You know, just if I get a PhD, it'll be great. If I can be an assistant professor, it'll be great. If I can be a professor, it'll be great. If it can be, it's not, it doesn't work.
I got my PhD recently enough to remember idolizing all of those professors, you know, until you get into the inner ring and you say, oh, you guys are just kind of normal dudes. Yeah, absolutely. And that is what he's saying. And that can drive you crazy. Do you think any of our students are inner ringers? And actually, I'll just kind of leave that as a rhetorical question. And this goes back to the discussion we're having. They're all inner ringers. So their ambition, and ambition can be good. In fact, Lewis makes a point that this is probably the great mainspring of human action. But our passion is also one of the surest ways to get us to compromise our values, to not even think of our values, because we need to get into that inner ring. You know, integrity is a word that we use all the time on the yard. And my students like use it a gajillion times in their papers. And I call it honor, courage, and commitment soup. It's just blah, 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 without really kind of thinking about what it means. Does anybody want to venture sort of a definition of integrity? And I'll just give this a few seconds, and maybe the pause is like, aha, I've never thought about this.
I can say something.
Yes.
So I'm the mother of 3 sons, and we talk a lot about what's right when they were growing up, and they always say, well, so-and-so was doing it. And, you know, and I'd always say, you know, it's not like what you were doing that you didn't get caught for, or that the group thought was right. So I always say, don't compare yourself to the lowest common denominator. And if it's the right thing to do, then you wouldn't mind if somebody were watching you do it. So that's just what integrity is.
Yeah, that whole idea of what you're doing when nobody's looking. I think that's a really critical part of it. I think the etymology is kind of helpful here. You know, it comes from the Latin integrare, which is to make whole, which suggests that there are parts. And I think that generally a good way of understanding those parts are our principles, our values on one side, and the other part is our actions. And when our actions and our principles are aligned, we are persons of integrity. When our actions don't match what we think of as our principles, things go wrong. Things start going wrong inside. We suffer cognitive dissonance. There's now 2 people here. The parts are now separate. There was a David Lubin, who's a scholar at Georgetown Law, who also what is his role in Stockdale?
He's a senior scholar at Stockdale as well, and he helps lead the Stockdale discussion group every year.
Great, yeah, awesome guy. He wrote a really fascinating paper on this, integrity and its cures, and I highly recommend reading it, where he gives us a different look at integrity. So yes, integrity is our drive to maintain, to ensure our actions are aligned with our principles, can really make us do good things out there, can make us recognize that we've crossed the moral thermocline. But when we err, when one of our actions is inconsistent, well, there's a couple of things that we can do. Primarily, you know, the best way out of this is going to be to, okay, I've got to fix this and do the hard work to bring my actions back in line with my principles. And those can be hard, like I can apologize, I can admit to a teacher that I violated the honor concept in some ways. Things that will be really hard to do, but that's how you bring them back in line. What Lubin says in his paper is that actually most people don't take that route. Instead of bringing their actions back up to meet their principles, they'll bring their principles back down to now make them consistent. And now I've resolved the cognitive dissonance. I am a whole person once again. And yet my principles have been degraded through this process. So again, this can work both ways. Yeah, Marcus.
I was just going to throw the example he throws out there just because it's really striking to me. David Lubin teaches law school, and he says all law students worry that they're going to have to take a case that conflicts with their principles. And this is a deep worry of people in law school. And people at the end of their legal careers are fascinated that that never happened. And so, I don't know, it's a powerful example for me, at least.
And at the end of and the way that we do this, the way we're able to bring these two ideas in line, kind of brings us to this next point of rationalizations. So Lubin tells us that we're able to compromise our principles. The way we're able to do that is through rationalization. He doesn't go any further in this. He just says, this is what a rationalization is. I asked David if he'd ever read this paper by Anand and several others. It was published, I think, in a business journal, and he hadn't. And it's like we read them together in our class, and it's a great combination. I'm not quite the thespian that Marcus is, but I'll do my best to do a dramatic reading of. Okay, so here are 6. Rationalizations that Anand and I'll write about. Tell me if you recognize any of these. Come on, man, I had no choice. 2, no biggie. No one was really hurt. The 3rd, hey, they got what they deserved. They asked for it. 4, who the heck are you to criticize me? 5, hey, I answer to a higher cause. My boss, my friends, the troops. Okay, and the 6th one, I've earned the right to do whatever the hell I want. Okay, any of those rationalizations sound familiar? Hopefully you've seen them in other people, but they are powerful, right? They're powerful things. So 2 others really quickly, and then I want to pass the baton over to my colleague. The 5th of these 6 external influences that shape or bias our moral perception is socialization. So every organization has a socialization strategy, has a strategy for bringing on the new guy, to ensuring that they follow the what we in this inner ring, perhaps, what we think is right and wrong. So we introduce them to their sense of right and wrong. Hopefully, when you come into a new organization, you find yourself feeling pretty good about it, and you are easily socialized. Sometimes, maybe not. Certainly, our students. I mean, we can see how they are socialized into this new world that they're entering, and that for different students, that can be pretty radical. This idea, even this idea of don't ever lie, cheat, and steal. That doesn't, I did. That's not how my high school was. And for others, it's a very natural process. But plebe summer in our first year here, and actually the entire Naval Academy experience is a process of socialization. And then the final aspect I'd like to add is just time. Time as an external influence that's shaping our moral perception. We tend to always think we don't have enough of it. to stop and to deliberate, to stop and to do that deliberate moral reflection that Marcus is going to talk about. Sometimes that's right, and sometimes you hope you've done that moral reflection before, while you were in NE 203. So when you're doing it at at the speed of sound, you can do it well. But often, and I think way too often, we think we have less time than we have, which is why I ask my students that maybe the first thing that they should ask themselves once they feel that they've crossed the moral thermocline is to stop and ask yourself how much time I have to make my decision. If I have 2 seconds to make my decision, stop thinking about it and make your decision. Check. If you have 2 hours, and this is a decision that you believe warrants deliberate moral analysis, then take that time, because this might be the biggest decision of your life, and it can change your life. Okay. I've got a couple of slides that will kind of lead into Marcus's discussion, but I want to stop here for a second and ask if you have any thoughts, because this is or questions, because this slide I think is the meat of what I wanted to get across this morning. Okay, good. So let me run through these last couple of things to kind of put Marcus's talk into a little bit more context. So, once again, we're at this point where we feel we're confronting a decision that warrants deliberate moral analysis. We've crossed the moral thermocline, and I think it is useful personally to understand sort of 2 routes, 2 ways, or 2 types of decisions that we face on the bad side of the moral thermocline. Tests of integrity and moral dilemmas. Does anybody want to venture sort of an idea, but what's different about those 2 types of decisions? What makes a test of integrity different than a moral dilemma?
I'm not sure there is a difference.
Okay.
Because I would submit that part of your integrity, or almost all, is based on your morals. And to apply to the midshipmen, I can think of instances where, because time is tight, Karen alluded to this, usually we see a spike towards the end of the semester because where they allow their integrity to be compromised.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that I would think it's not that much different from testing your integrity. Are you going to cheat? That gets down to a moral dilemma.
So when you're asking yourself whether you're going to cheat or not, do you know what the right answer is?
If we abide by the honor concept, yeah.
We should.
Should.
And I think, and so Mary, I love your explanation of that. But I think I like to make this distinction, and this is a little bit personal. This isn't something that we necessarily teach, although a lot of my military instructors do, and I think it's useful. That a test of integrity is when I do know the right thing to do, and therefore I do know the wrong thing to do. And I think some of the things that would alert us to that is if we are breaking the law or a norm. It's very likely that we're in the realm of a test of integrity. again, where we know right and wrong. For telling a lie, we probably know that that's wrong. I say probably because obviously there are laws and norms that are worth breaking, but typically not. And then so that the moral dilemma would be that I don't quite know what right and wrong is. So maybe not that, am I going to cheat on a test or not? Maybe if it starts going, do I bring to my professor's attention that Roger just cheated? Maybe that starts moving closer toward a moral dilemma. These are just sort of some classics. And the truth versus loyalty one, boy howdy, are our students ever, do they swim in that one? Do they face that one every day in the hall? Justice versus mercy. As soon as they become second lieutenants, they're going to be in this realm of having to think through this at their first captain's mast. The few versus the many, which is especially hard if the few is the us and the many is the them. And then also thinking long term. Those are just sort of some classic moral dilemmas. We're going to work through a couple here in the next section. And the reason that I find it valuable to isolate these two is for a test of integrity. And remember, the whole purpose of this, of what I'm trying to talk about, is when is it time to pull out your moral deliberation roadmap? If, no kidding, I know the right and wrong answer, I don't need my moral deliberation roadmap. I still don't have to know what John Stuart Mill would say about this. I still don't have to think about Kant. And if you don't have to think about Kant, you probably shouldn't. He's hard. So this is just where we apply our practical wisdom. So that combination of character and judgment that we've built through the years, and we make our decision. So right versus wrong, do the right thing. It's harder to do than just saying that. I mean, it is, moral temptation is real, and we've all been tempted to do the wrong thing, and we've done it. We've made the wrong choice, but hopefully we'll make the right choice and move on. Moral dilemma. Now it's time to pull out the moral deliberation roadmap. And you all have read about it. And this is where I'm going to do the handoff to Marcus, pending any quick questions, and then we'll take a little bit of a break, I think, and then move over to Marcus. Any quick questions of this? I mean, we're not done yet. We've still got you for another 2 hours. Good. And also, I welcome your feedback on this, because the portion we're doing on moral perception is relatively new. This is part of the pilot. And again, this is the part of the pilot that really gets me very excited, because so many moral failures are made by people who don't realize that they've crossed the moral thermocline, or whose character has been so degraded by those things out there that degrade our character that even our routine moral decision making has been degraded by this. Okay, so with that, Marcus, what do you think about coming back at 10:10 or?
I'm pro break. That sounds perfect. If that's enough time for everybody.